Okay, so this is the problem of other people's minds that we have when we talk about dualism. And the main problem is that my own mind is perceived directly by introspection, but other people's minds are perceived indirectly via the senses. So we're going to be looking at Wittgenstein quite a lot. So this is his beetle in the box analogy.
Imagine a group of people, each with a box. In everyone's box is a thing they call a beetle. But no one is ever allowed to look in anyone else's box. They can only look into their own. However, they can talk meaningfully about beetles even though they don't know what others have in their boxes, or indeed, if there's anything in them at all. The thing in each person's box is irrelevant to the shared public meaning of beetle. Its meaning is determined by the use people make of the term, not the private something hidden away from view. Whatever is or isn't in each person's box is irrelevant. It cancels out. Many of us think of our experiences as private, hidden away inside us. You can never enter my mind and find out whether your color experiences are like mine, for example, or whether our pain experiences are the same. You can't see the beetle in my box, nor I the one in yours. Ludwig Wittgenstein used the beetle in the box analogy to suggest that the meaning of sensation words such as pain isn't given by referring to some private, inner, introspected something, a sensation to which you alone have access. In his view, there can't be more to the public meaning of our language than we are capable of teaching each other. And the private something, the beetle, can't have a role in that teaching because we can't get at it.
Okay, so we're going to unpick that beetle analogy as we go through this lesson. The difference between the public and the private. I mean, this is the problem with other people's minds, though, is that our own mind is private. Other people's mind, we can't perceive them. All we can do is indirectly perceive what we think is the mind via our senses through other people's behaviour. Now, Gilbert Ryle, who was against dualism, argued that about dualism, that essentially we will become a ghost in a machine. Each of us lives the life of a ghostly Robinson Crusoe. Absolute solitude is the ineluctable destiny of the soul. Nice. So, dualists have come up with two strategies to address this problem: argument from analogy and the argument to the best hypothesis. So starting off with the argument from the analogy with my own case, it's really simple. John Stuart Mill said, I conclude that other human beings have feelings like me because first they have bodies like me, which I know in my own case to be the antecedent conditions of feeling, and because secondly they exhibit the acts and other outward signs, which in my own case I know by experience to be caused by feelings. So he's essentially saying, this is my experience of life. This is my experience of where my feelings come from. And if this is what it's like for me, then I can make a case to say that it is going to be the same for other people. So I am directly aware of pain, and then I infer this pain from somebody else. So when I accidentally put a nail through my palm of my hand, I was, believe me, directly aware of that pain. I had to go to hospital, the whole lot. And my dad, who was with me at the time, he inferred that I was in pain because of the way I was jumping around, holding my hand, and using words that I don't normally use in front of my dad. But he could not directly see the pain, or he had to infer that pain from my behavior. So that analogy really is therefore saying, well, if this is how I will behave, then when I see other people behaving the same way, then I can infer that they are experiencing what I would be experiencing. Now, two criticisms with that. I mean, first of all, to argue an analogy but only using one single case is normally very, very weak. And so, but the dualist response to that is that the analogy is actually based on more than one observation. Yes, we look at the behavior, but we can observe our physiology. Our physiology is the same as well, but it's still not a very strong argument. So we are, even though they say we are the same species and that we have the same body, it's still a single case, because my view of pain might be very different from somebody else's view of pain. We all have different pain thresholds. The second criticism is the problem of making independent checks. Whenever we are comparing and contrasting, we're able to do that because we can actually compare and contrast. We can check what other people are thinking and feeling, but we can't do that when it comes to dualism and the private and the ineffable. Since one person cannot in principle visit another person's mind, there could be no way of establishing the necessary correlation between their external and internal mental states. So we can't make independent checks, and a single case is normally very weak when it comes to analogy. So dualists argue the mind is private, therefore by the very nature impossible to check. So they would kind of agree with the second criticism, but just simply say that's the way minds are. So we move on to the conceptual problem of other minds. Wittgenstein said if one has to imagine someone else's pain on the model of one's own, this is none too easy a thing to do, for I have to imagine pain which I do not feel on the model of pain which I do feel. So he is moving from the specific to the general. He gains concepts of mind from my own mind, and then uses that and moves on to the general to create concepts of other people's minds. And he says, well, actually, that's problematic. If we would take away mind and replace it with pain, I gain a concept of pain from my own experience of it. I move to the general, I frame a concept of pain for other people. But it's problematic because we know that people experience pain in very different ways. So he argued that a pain not felt by me would surely be a contradiction in terms if the only basis for understanding the word was my own experience of it. Okay, so it's a contradiction, a pain not saying there's a pain not from, when people say I feel your pain. Wittgenstein said no, you don't, you can't. You cannot experience another person's pain. All you can do is that all you are doing really is you are comparing your concept of pain and assuming that somebody else has a similar concept of pain as you are. So it becomes a contradiction in terms. He argued to know that what I'm feeling is pain, then I need to be able to contrast the feeling with other minds. So he's using pain like as an analogy. I cannot assume that the sensation I call pain is the same for other minds, as I've just previously talked about. Therefore, the argument from an analogy fails and dualism is false. So if we go through the same argument again, but replacing pain with mind, to know that what I am feeling is a mind, then I need to be able to compare, contrast, and feeling with other minds. I cannot assume that what I call the mind is the same for other minds. Therefore, the argument from analogy fails and dualism is false. So according to Cartesian dualism, so that's Descartes, there is no conceptually necessary connection between having a certain sort of physical form and having a mind. Oh, let's just unpick that sentence. If you remember about Cartesian dualism, he talked about there are two separate substances. The mind and the body are two separate substances. He used Leibniz's rule: if there's one thing that's ever so slightly different, then there are two different substances. And because there was no connection between the mind and the body, that led Chalmers to go down the route of it is possible to actually conceive of philosophical zombies. And that's because, according to Cartesian dualism, there is no necessary connection between the mind and the body. So this leads to the possibility of dualism, the conceivability of philosophical zombies, like Chalmers did. And in that case, Wittgenstein said you could conceive of a teapot with a mind and someone writhing in agony after standing on a nail, not to be in pain. Chalmers said, yes, you could. But Wittgenstein would argue, really? Seriously? Is it really conceivable in real life to see someone writhing in pain with a nail in their foot and for them not to be feeling pain? Then why are they behaving in that particular way? It's impossible for us to seriously imagine, therefore, there must be a close connection between behavior of the physical form and the mind. So for Wittgenstein, he basically is saying you cannot really conceive of a teapot with a mind and a body without a mind and yet still behaving as if it had a mind. It is inconceivable because it is going to be the mind that enables the body to behave in that particular way. And this leads us to the private language argument. Now, qualia requires classification. So, for example, what is red, what is green, what is yellow? We'll use colors as an example. We classify colors. Now, the Cartesian approach is for the classification to use private language because our mind is private. It's ineffable. There must be a distinction, though, between what is a correct and incorrect classification. So, how do we know that the private language approach is classifying a qualia of, say, red correctly? Now, when it comes to the public realm, public language can distinguish between correct and incorrect usage. We can all agree publicly that this is red and that is yellow, and so on. And so we can come to an agreement and we can classify qualia. But when it comes to a private language, we cannot. All we are saying is that the experience of red that I am having now, the quality of red that I am having now, is similar to one that I had before. It may not be exactly the same. It could be wrong, but it doesn't really matter. And Wittgenstein says, well, if you could be wrong, you could be right. If you could be right, you could be wrong. But either way, it's not a classification. You cannot classify qualia within private language. You can only classify qualia within public language because there was an agreement within the public of what that qualia actually is, of what red actually is. So the public world is the correct and incorrect usage. The private language doesn't. Now, this leads us to basically the second argument that dualists argue, is that the existence of other minds is the best hypothesis that we have. Now, this is let's start again. This is an abductive argument. Remember, abductive is where you have the conclusion, you have the observable conclusion, you work backwards to essentially use an inductive method to come up with the best explanation of what we observe. And this is what science does. You know, science observes natural phenomena and then works backwards as to what is the best explanation of what we have observed. So what we can observe is people's behavior. That is what we observe. We cannot observe someone's mind, but the mind is the best hypothesis that we have to explain the physical behaviors that we can observe. So if we use that, I'll come back to using an analogy, we cannot directly see atoms, but what we can do is we observe the behavior of objects, we observe nature, and from that we have a theory, you have atomic theory, and then we can predict how things are going to behave based on this theory, and it is the best hypothesis that we have to explain why the world is the way it is. We don't need to see it directly for it to be true. And so therefore, we don't need to directly perceive a mind for it to be true. It needs to be the best hypothesis that we have at this moment in time. Now, limitativists would agree with them, saying, yeah, it's the best hypothesis we've had for millennia, but now with fMRI scans coming along and the improvement of neuroscience, there are going to be better hypotheses that come along, and we can get rid of the folk psychology and come with more scientific explanations of people's behavior and what qualia actually is. But for now, dualists would argue the existence of the mind is the best hypothesis. So, using an abductive argument to justify a dualist view, when we look at the behavior of an individual, then the best hypothesis is the other person has a mind. They use the analogy of being unable to see atoms, but they are the best hypothesis explaining behavior of objects. So we've moved really all the way through from saying, look, we have a problem about other people's minds because we cannot observe them directly. And so they try and come with the argument of analogy. But there are two main criticisms of that, in that we cannot compare, contrast, and check. And there was what was the other criticism? Oh yes, using one example as your basis for analogy is a very weak argument. And then we have the conceptual problem of other people's minds, in how that we cannot classify qualia in the private realm, but we can in the public realm. And so therefore dualism is going to be wrong, and Wittgenstein's arguments in that we cannot compare and contrast pain with other people, and he talked about therefore our quality about pain is going to be false, and he compared that with the mind. So therefore, dualism is false. So there we have, we've gone through the whole situation really about the problem with other people's minds, how dualists try to answer that problem, and then how mainly Wittgenstein came back and said, nah, that's a lot of rubbish. It doesn't really work.